there's no kudos, and there's a downside. People might, there's a fear of scooping, and by the time, the problem always is by the time you've mined all the data, why are you going to now spend another week formatting it for others to use? Like move on. You're under a lot of time pressure, and maybe as an academic, what the incentive, it's costly, and the benefits. It actually seem cost. People might scoop you, they might read your stuff. I don't think a lot of those things are true. I think it's very unlikely actually you'll be scooped, but it's, there's these possible risks that people see. I think many of them are not justified, but there is, there's a kind of, in a sense of a default, why give out data that might help people prove you wrong? Honestly, as scientists, we should of course do that, but in people's head, there's that aspect of, why give out data? What am I getting out of it? Obviously, in our kind of theoretical vision of what we should be as scientists, we should never think that. We should always be thinking, of course we should give it out so my stuff can be checked. Of course we should give it out so other people can build on my work. But that isn't, we're human after all.
Yeah, and we're in a particularly competitive era of human
It is.
history.
Yes.
It's very hard for people to take that kind of risk.
By the way, I think that's a really interesting thing. It's something that fascinated me. How do we establish that? It does seem a point, which is that academia, it's one of the reasons at the moment, I'm now working full-time at the Open Knowledge Foundation, but, I was an academic till quite recently, full-time as it were. I'm still kind of, as it were, part-time. But has something changed as well? One of the ironies is we're talking about open data, about promoting collaboration, but is one of the things that's happened is that kind of collegial atmosphere of academia has been slightly undermined. One of the obvious things is the way that research assessment now is carried on. There's a great pressure on academics, publish or perish, and so on. But I think, just as an aside, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's an interesting question about how that relates to openness. One of the things I used to bring up was to say, we live in a world in theory where we have ever more, we have, at least in developed countries, really people don't really want for anything. Relatively, no one really starves. It's something that even, a century ago, and then still in many countries. So we're in this world in which we have kind of so much plenty. And one of the interesting questions is, yet people don't get happier. And one of the questions is about kind of competition and kind of comparison to others and so on. And it's an interesting point that I also think the point about, one of the interesting things about openness is also about sharing and collaboration, which I think are really, really positive. It's like friends. There's really no downside to friends. There's certain aspects of human activity that just seem naturally positive. And I think those, like having more of that, and it's an interesting question to ask, why is there a sense that it's more competition, more cutthroat, less fun maybe, academia than it once was? And how does that relate to openness and sharing in that way? In fact, is it a problem that people will have real problems doing open data and open science because there's all this competition? And also conversely, could the general ethos that's related to openness inform science more generally and perhaps roll this feeling, if there is this feeling, back about kind of competition or lack of collaboration? Because clearly, what individually we can understand why we're incented to do that, collectively for the profession it's clearly a loss. When I don't share with other people, when I don't feel positive, when I don't feel good, when I don't enjoy what I'm doing, happy scientists I'm sure are probably do more. So even if you're just a funding, even if you're just in the government thinking how much bang for our buck are we getting, happy collaborating scientists are going to be more productive scientists. Well, I don't think anyone. I guess one question often the open access class, who's going to pay for this? The irony of that is, to some extent, we live in an era, at least on plain reproduction, no one needs to pay for it. It is relatively so cheap. Obviously, there are costs. There are costs of running repositories of papers, but we're talking amounts which are basically trivial compared to science budget. I don't know. You look at archive.org. I think they're seeking to raise $300,000 to $500,000 a year to run the repository there. It's just nothing. The other argument is, we need all these people to do reviewing, to do top journals, Nature. There's like so many submissions. We need editors and we need people. But of course, their point is the reviewing is largely done free already by the academic profession. The other part of it, I feel, is almost artificial because we've got these kind of incredibly we've got this kind of artificial scarcity. Everyone's trying to get into particular top journals. Those particular top journals do have a lot of kind of bureaucratic overhead. A lot of literature could just be eliminated in a world in which the journal system ran differently. I can have a kind of theory of something I'd call like a not a journal. A world in which all the papers are open access. There's no reason I couldn't get, people couldn't just get together and kind of almost ad hocly and form like not journals where they agree to review certain papers, and I could just simply say, in the way that I follow somebody on Twitter, I could simply say, well, I follow your recommendations, or I follow the journal. If you get together with 3 other people and decide you're going to review, I don't know, papers on, I'm thinking, let's say, in economics on kind of, I don't know, employment models and wage determination or whatever. I just say, okay, I'm going to always subscribe to things that your not a journal group of people recommend. That's what a journal ultimately, so that filtering aspect, which is really the purpose that journals have now come to have, the main costs associated with that aren't borne actually by the journals, it's the reviewing, and we have an extremely inefficient and stupid reviewing system in which lots of reviewing goes on. Whenever I read a paper, I think some judgment of it, and that's lost the world, and a couple of people get to determine what goes into a particular journal, and if they say no, we never see their review anyway. We have this very inefficient system. So it seems to me the main objection there is a kind of false one. It's kind of saying if we kept our current system that seems like developed in 1910, well, there are these costs, and anyway, they're slightly artificial costs to do with these closed journals which have a large number of submissions. So in general, that objection I don't see so much. I mean, I think the other objection is that it costs me time and effort for scientists. I think that's to some extent a truth. I mean, open access shouldn't be. It should just be everyone publishes. Even if they're publishing their paper in a closed journal nowadays, they should publish it on the web, and they shouldn't have to ever sign over copyright and those kind of things. That's ludicrous. But so really, that's almost by default. And as a scientist, you want to do that because you want more people to read your paper. I think on the data side of things, I think there is a cost at the moment. Really upfrontly, I think there is. I think it's not as easy as it should be. And we at the OKF are working very heavily with projects like CCAN, the Comprehensive Knowledge Archive Network, and other tools and services we're building to make that really easy. You really want a world in which kind of there's just a button on your desktop or as part of Excel or whatever, you can just hit a button and your stuff is uploaded. Maybe initially to your private space, and then at some point you can hit publish. I'm certainly not big, by the way. I'm not big on enforcing open notebook science. If you want to do that's great, but I don't think it's a core part of open science. So I think we have got to make that easier. And I think we have got to make it a default. So at the moment, even people are open who want to be open don't license. So I think we need that kind of attitude and knowledge awareness that happens maybe in software. In a computer science lab now, people, students, faculty, whatever, if they're doing a project, they'll know at least what open source is, and they'll probably by default open source it. And it will just be a copy and paste of an existing document. I think we want that to be almost as default for scientists. Now, they're not as sophisticated in some ways. Computer scientists are quite sophisticated about software, and some of this almost relates to software, putting in the README or whatever. So I think the other point is baking it into some of the tools. So it goes back to that tools point. You want licenses to kind of be baked in by default, maybe, and you want those to be open licenses. So I think there's, I think why people are doing it is a lack of awareness. I think the journal I've described quite a lot of the lock-in and the way we should get away from that. And for data, I think we have got to make it easier, both to license, make it very easy to license, but also to actually get your data out there. So kind of the two parts of openness, there is a license and it's actually accessible. And we do need tools, and we need some, I think, funding there, be it prototypes or some actual production services to make that really easy. Well, I've got this paper called "The Dissemination of Scholarly Information." I think old approaches and new possibilities, which is about how we're locked in and what could be different. I can send you that paper if you want. I mean, it's on my website and it's on my economics page. The answer there is to go back, which is we have a reward system at the moment. We have an issue which is particularly in the modern era, people have got, because of the information explosion and the complexity of society, there's those running things have felt a greater need to have formalized methods of assessment and allocation of resource. So to put that in simple terms, back in public funding of science has massively increased over the last 100 years, and certainly actually even since the Second World War. It's been a real explosion actually in public funding of science relatively. Now, there's been then the question, well, who do we allocate all that money to? How do we assess their work? And even within the profession, how do we give out professor chairs, and how do we allocate that? And in response to that, obviously, there's been some desire to have a formalized method. As once upon a time, it could just been, well, we'll ask we'll ask the other professors, and they'll decide. And they'll say, oh, this guy's a promising young man, we'll appoint him, or a promising young woman, we'll appoint him. And that's not. And so we've entered into an area of kind of greater research, research assessment, and greater formalism, and that in some ways has rigidized. I mean, it has helped, for example, to reinforce, I think, the lock-in to journals, in that there's this backwards-looking assessment of paper, basically, what papers you publish in how prominent journals, and the weighting of those journals is backward looking, and it creates a whole lock-in to quite a rigid journal system, assessment system that doesn't favor openness, really. Really, in several ways, not only does it not, not only is it often closed access journals, but more fundamentally, many journals are very restrictive. If you publish any of your stuff before you put it in their journal, stuff will get kicked out. So that whole methodology of like openness, which might be related to early data sharing and more wide data sharing, is really difficult. So I think, to say it's kind of not direct, it's an indirect relationship between the current assessment models, often based, both formal and informal, based on kind of informal, sometimes formal, but mainly informal now, kind of bibliometrics. This is a top-ranked journal, this is a low-ranked one, and that kind of stuff has led to some degree of a lock-in, and some degree, I think, hindering a bit the open approach. But it's not, I don't think it's the fundamental thing. I think that more is just a problem where I think research assessment, like all kinds of formalized assessment in areas where people do a lot of things that aren't always easy to access, is kind of difficult. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are fashions in perfect. I mean, how do you know if you've done a paper today that in 10 years' time will be really important? How do you assess people's contribution, in teaching and all, these other areas? How do you estimate a colleague in a department who doesn't necessarily publish themselves, but maybe spins out huge numbers of ideas for other colleagues? There's all of these informal things that exist, and it's economics sort of get a well-known thing of studying. If we measure certain aspects of someone doing something, well, then they're going to distort all their effort towards those things that are measured, and that normally is a distortion because there's lots of other things you do which are difficult, hard, or whatever to measure. At the same time, it's a difficult problem because otherwise, how do we decide in some fair and relatively transparent way how to give out resource within the profession?